The polished mahogany floors of Westfield Academy's music hall gleamed under the soft amber glow of late afternoon light. The building itself stood as a testament to old money and older traditions. A Gothic revival structure of weathered stone and leaded glass windows that had housed the prestigious music program for over a century. Outside, autumn painted the campus in rich hues of crimson and gold, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection maintained within these hallowed walls. Ethan Miller's fingers hovered over the keys of the Steinway grand piano, his breath caught in his throat from a mixture of reverence and trepidation. At 17, he was tall and lean, with deep brown eyes that reflected years of unspoken yearning. The chocolate hue of his skin seemed to absorb the fading light that streamed through the high arched windows, casting his angular features in dramatic relief. This wasn't the first time he had slipped into the music hall after hours. It was simply the only way he could access an instrument that wasn't marred by broken keys or stuck pedals. The melody that flowed from deep within him was complex and achingly beautiful, a convergence of classical structure with haunting jazz inflections. Ethan closed his eyes, losing himself in the music taking shape beneath his fingertips. He never heard the sharp click of heels approaching until it was too late. "What do you think you're doing?" Mrs. Harrington's voice cracked like a whip across the serene space. Ethan startled, yanking his hands from the keys as if they'd suddenly turned white-hot. I was just," he stammered, straightening his worn button-down shirt. "You were just trespassing in a restricted area." Mrs. Harrington's thin face contorted with indignation, her blonde hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her features taut. Her tweed skirt suit and pearl necklace were the uniform of old guard privilege. "This room is reserved exclusively for students enrolled in the music program." "I'm sorry, I thought—" "You thought," she laughed coldly, devoid of humor. "Do you even know how to read music?" She snatched the notebook from the stand. "What is this? Chicken scratch?" By now a group of students had gathered at the doorway, those who had been practicing with the evening orchestra. Among them stood Lily Zhang, clutching her violin case protectively against her chest, and Blake Wellington, Mrs. Harrington's prize student, smirking as he witnessed Ethan's humiliation. Blake's cashmere sweater and tailored slacks marked him as clearly as a branded cattle, wealth and entitlement personified. "I'm composing something," Ethan said quietly, reaching for his notebook. Mrs. Harrington held it beyond his reach. "This isn't music. This is defacement of musical notation." She waved the notebook for all to see. "Westfield Academy has maintained an elite music program for generations. We have trained concert pianists and orchestral composers. Students who haven't undergone years of rigorous training do not touch these instruments." She jerked her chin toward the door. "Out! And if I catch you in here again, you'll face expulsion." Ethan reclaimed his notebook from her grasp and hurried out, head bowed, avoiding the stares of the other students who parted like the Red Sea to let him pass. As the door closed behind him, he heard Mrs. Harrington telling the students, "That's why we need standards." Ethan stood frozen in the empty hallway, clutching his notebook to his chest, his reflection fractured across the glass trophy case opposite. Achievements he would never be allowed to reach for, not in Mrs. Harrington's program, not in her world. His shoulders slumped as he made his way through the maze of identical corridors, each adorned with portraits of illustrious alumni and benefactors whose pale faces stared down with the same dismissive gaze Mrs. Harrington had perfected. The weight of their judgment seemed to press down on him with each step, a familiar burden he had carried since his first day at Westfield. The Miller apartment was small but meticulously maintained, filled with mismatched furniture that had been carefully tended to over years of use. The scent of jerk chicken, his mother's specialty, lingered in the air. She had left a plate in the microwave for him, despite working double shifts at the hospital. Ethan slipped into his bedroom, barely larger than a closet, with most of the space occupied by a digital keyboard set on a wobbly stand. The walls were plastered with posters of great composers, Mozart, Beethoven, and his personal hero, William Grant Still, the Dean of African American Composers. He placed his notebook on the small desk and collapsed onto the bed, Mrs. Harrington's words still burning in his chest. He pulled out his phone, plugged in his earbuds, and played back a recording of the symphony he was composing. Though the sound quality was poor, the subtleties of the piece were evident, a tapestry of cultural influences woven into classical form. "You home, baby?" His mother's voice called softly from the hallway. "Yes, Mom." He quickly removed his earbuds. Mrs. Miller stood in the doorway, still in her nursing scrubs, her eyes tired but warm. The fine lines around them had deepened over years of night shifts and worry, but they crinkled now with affection. "Were you sneaking into the school piano again?" Ethan nodded, avoiding her gaze. She sat beside him, the mattress dipping beneath her weight. "What happened?" "Mrs. Harrington," he said bitterly. "She said I don't belong there." Mrs. Miller sighed, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Her fingers were calloused from work, but her touch remained tender. She wouldn't know real talent if it hit her in the face. She picked up the composition notebook, flipping through pages dense with notes. "Your father would be so proud. You know that. He always said you were born with music in your blood." Ethan smiled faintly at the mention of his father, a jazz saxophonist who had passed away when Ethan was 8, leaving him with a love for music and a few old records. "You've got gifts, Ethan, gifts that no classroom can teach, especially not with people like Mrs. Harrington." She touched the notebook. "This right here is your ticket, your voice. Don't let anyone silence you, Mrs." Miller stood up, wincing slightly from back pain. "Get some rest and eat that chicken before it dries out completely. Tomorrow's another day for you to shine." She kissed the top of his head and walked to the door. "Mom," Ethan called after her, "do you think Dad would understand what I'm trying to do with this symphony?" She looked back, a smile mixing sadness and pride. "Baby, your father would have felt it from your first cry." Her voice softened. "Now sleep. Tomorrow you'll stir things up again." After she left, Ethan returned to his keyboard, put on his headphones, and began to play. His fingers transformed into conduits for the music that had always flowed within him, music that Mrs. Harrington would never believe he could compose. As he played, memories of his father flooded back. Afternoons spent listening to records together, the rich, warm tone of his saxophone filling their old apartment, his patient guidance as Ethan's small fingers first explored the keyboard. His father had recognized something in him even then, a natural understanding of music that transcended formal training. In the quiet of his room, with only the muted sounds of his keyboard in his ears, Ethan felt his father's presence most strongly. Each note was a conversation with his memory, each melody a tribute to his legacy. This symphony wasn't just Ethan's creation, it was the culmination of generations of musical heritage that had been systematically excluded from the mainstream. The next morning, Ethan stood before the door of the music department office, heart hammering. He clutched an official application for the Westfield Academy music program. Mr. Reynolds, the program director, had mentioned an opening when they had passed each other in the hallway the previous week, before the incident with Mrs. Harrington. At that moment, Ethan had allowed himself a sliver of hope. "You can do this," he muttered to himself, adjusting his second-hand blazer, the nicest outfit he owned. Gathering his courage, he pushed the door open. Inside, Mrs. Harrington sat at her desk, glasses perched on her nose, reviewing sheet music. She glanced up, recognition and displeasure evident in the tightening of her lips. "Mr. Miller," she said coolly, "if you're here about yesterday, my decision stands." Ethan swallowed hard. "Actually, I'm here to apply for the vacant position in the music program." He extended the folder toward her, struggling to keep his hand steady. Mrs. Harrington stared at the papers as if they carried contagion. "You can't be serious." "I am serious." His voice gained resolve. "Mr. Reynolds mentioned there was an opening for a pianist after Claire Williams transferred." "Mr. Reynolds," she laughed coldly, "isn't aware of your limitations. This program requires years of formal training." "Have you had any formal training, Mr. Miller?" "I've been playing since I was 4. "With a qualified instructor?" She interrupted, eyebrow raised. "My father taught me until he passed, and then I taught myself." She cut him off again with palpable disdain. As I suspected. Just then the office door opened and Lily Jang entered, hesitating when she saw Ethan. Her sleek black hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, her uniform impeccable. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know someone was here." "It's fine, Lily." Mrs. Harrington's voice turned artificially sweet. "Mr. Miller was just leaving." "Actually," Ethan said with unexpected firmness, "I'm still waiting for an answer regarding my application." Mrs. Harrington's smile faltered momentarily. "Fine. You want fairness? The Winter Showcase auditions are in 2 weeks. Basic requirements: 1 classical piece, 1 original composition, and a sight reading test." She slid a form across the desk. "But remember, we have very stringent standards. This isn't a community center talent show." "I understand." Ethan took the form. "I doubt that," she replied. "Now Lily needs my assistance with legitimate program matters." Ethan nodded stiffly, turning to leave, nearly bumping into Lily, who was watching him with curious eyes. "Hi," she said softly as they both exited. "Are you really going to audition?" "Trying to," Ethan mumbled. Lily glanced back at the closing office door. "I heard you play yesterday before—" "You know, it was beautiful." Ethan looked at her in surprise. "You think so?" "It wasn't like anything I've ever heard. Complex, but with an emotional clarity that was breathtaking." She hesitated, seeming embarrassed by her enthusiasm. "Anyway, good luck. Mrs. Harrington is tough, but if Mr. Reynolds hears you, you might have a chance." "Thanks," Ethan said, a spark of hope kindling in his chest. "What will you compose for your original piece?" Lily asked. Ethan hesitated slightly, then decided to trust her. "It's actually part of a symphony I'm writing. I'm calling it Unheard Voices. It's about—" "A symphony?" Blake Wellington's mocking voice interrupted as he approached, followed by several other music students. "Listen to this, guys. The janitor's kid is writing a symphony." Ethan's face burned. "My mom's a nurse, not a janitor," he said quietly. "Anyway," Blake smirked, "Mrs. Harrington says symphonies take years of theory and composition study. Did you learn that on YouTube?" "Leave him alone, Blake," Lily's voice hardened. "Oh, defending him now? Careful, Lily, or people might think Westfield is lowering its standards." Blake shot Ethan a challenging look. "Good luck with the audition. You'll need it." As they walked away, Lily turned back to Ethan with an apologetic expression. "Don't mind them. They're just afraid of competition." "Competition?" Ethan laughed humorlessly. "Mrs. Harrington probably threw my application in the trash already." "Then make her fish it out," Lily said with surprising determination. "Play something she can't ignore." She checked her watch. "I have to go, but the practice rooms in the East Wing are usually empty during lunch if you need a place to practice." Ethan looked puzzled. "Why are you helping me?" Lily adjusted the strap of her violin case, smiling. "Because music should be about talent, not privilege. And because I really want to hear the rest of that symphony." As Lily walked away, Ethan looked down at the audition form in his hand. For the first time since yesterday, a genuine smile formed on his lips. He would make them listen, all of them. The practice room in the East Wing was a windowless cubicle with a slightly out-of-tune upright piano, but to Ethan it was paradise. As Lily had promised, it remained deserted during lunch periods, becoming his secret workshop over the following days. His fingers danced across the keys, recreating passages from the symphony that existed primarily in his head and hastily scribbled in his notebook. Music poured forth, complex and layered, infused with classical traditions and jazz, his father's favorite. The door creaked suddenly, causing Ethan to jump, expecting Mrs. Harrington's stern glare. But it was Lily slipping in, violin case in hand. "Sorry," she whispered. "I didn't want to interrupt. Just wanted to hear a bit more." Ethan hesitated briefly, then nodded toward the empty chair. "I'm working on the second movement. May I—" Lily gestured with her violin. He smiled and nodded, continuing to play while Lily quickly tuned up. After a few measures of listening, She began to contribute, her violin weaving through Ethan's piano melody with intuitive grace, as if reading directly from his mind. When they finished, both sat in stunned silence. "That was—" Lily began. "Yeah," Ethan replied. The connection was complete and undeniable. The lunch bell rang, breaking the magical moment. "Same time tomorrow?" Lily asked as she packed up her violin. And so they continued their clandestine practice each day at lunch. Occasionally, other students would linger outside to listen, curious before moving on. Rumors of mysterious melodies from the East Wing began to circulate. Once, Blake Wellington lingered outside the door for quite some time. The next day, Ethan found a note taped to the practice room door. "Amateurs not welcome. Stay with your own kind." "Don't let it bother you," Lily advised, seeing Ethan frown at the note. "He's scared because Mrs. Harrington keeps praising him, while he knows his talent doesn't come close to yours." Ethan shook his head. "It's not just him. It's this place. Honestly, even if I pass the audition, they'll never accept me." "Then force them to accept you," Lily insisted. "Your music. I've never heard anyone play like that. It deserves to be heard in concert halls, not hidden away in this box." During these practice sessions, Ethan found himself opening up to Lily about his father's influence on his music, how they would spend evenings dissecting jazz records and classical pieces alike, finding connections between seemingly disparate musical worlds. He spoke of the symphony as a tribute not just to his father, but to generations of musicians whose contributions had been erased or marginalized. Lily, in turn, shared her own struggles, the crushing pressure from her parents to excel, their insistence that she attend prestigious music conservatories despite her secret desire to explore ethnomusicology. In the cramped practice room, they found more than musical harmony. They found understanding. As the days passed, their collaboration deepened. Lily's classical training complemented Ethan's intuitive composition, each strengthening the other's weaknesses. What began as curiosity blossomed into a musical partnership neither had experienced before. The final days before the audition flew by. Ethan spent his days refining his piece and his nights continuing work on the symphony, often falling asleep at his keyboard. At home, his mother would gently remove his headphones and tuck a blanket around him. One evening, after they had finished practicing, Lily asked, "What inspired you to write this symphony?" Ethan's fingers paused on the keys. "My father used to tell me about black composers and musicians who never got recognition. People who created entire musical movements, then died in obscurity while others took the credit." He gazed into the distance. "This symphony is for them, the unheard voices." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "It's beautiful, Ethan. And after the audition next week, you will definitely be heard." They didn't notice Blake standing outside, watching with calculating eyes, his phone recording their conversation. The cozy office of Mr. Reynolds stood in stark contrast to Mrs. Harrington's rigid workspace. Jazz posters hung alongside classical concert programs on the walls, and in the corner sat a well-worn saxophone case. In his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and horn-rimmed glasses, Mr. Reynolds exuded the air of someone who genuinely loved all forms of music. "Mrs. Harrington, the winter showcase lineup looks fine, but I notice it seems rather homogeneous in style." He indicated the list before him, all European classical pieces by the same few composers. Mrs. Harrington's smile was rigid. "We're simply maintaining Westfield's standards. Parents and the board expect a certain caliber." Mr. Reynolds leaned back in his chair. "But I've been hearing rumors about some interesting melodies coming from the East Wing. An original composition?" Mrs. Harrington sat up straighter, her tone icy. "Just amateur tinkering. Hardly worth—" "Quite extraordinary, actually," a voice cut in from the doorway. Both turned to see Dr. Carter, the guest conductor for the masterclass series, standing at the entrance, tall and distinguished in his tailored suit, his deep brown skin contrasting with his silver hair, eyes sharp with intelligence. He was a legend in the classical music world, I was passing by yesterday, he continued, entering without invitation. Heard a piano-violin piece that blended Debussy, jazz harmonies, and something entirely fresh. He looked at Mrs. Harrington. One of your students? Before she could respond, Mr. Reynolds interjected. Would that be Ethan Miller? He applied recently. Miller, Mrs. Harrington's voice tightened, is not officially in the program. He's been sneaking into practice rooms with Jang. Whether officially enrolled or not, Dr. Carter said calmly. The music I heard was remarkable, especially for someone so young. Ethan applied for the open pianist position, Mr. Reynolds explained. He'll be auditioning next week. Is that so? Dr. Carter's eyes narrowed with interest. Merely a formality, Mrs. Harrington interrupted. He has no formal training, hardly up to standard. Mr. Reynolds frowned. Talent doesn't always come with credentials or pedigrees, Vivian. This isn't an inner-city charity case. She raised her voice, then stopped, seeming to realize she'd gone too far. I mean, we have traditions to uphold. Music itself is a tradition, Dr. Carter said gently, one that evolves through new voices. He turned to Mr. Reynolds. I'd like to attend the audition, if that's not too presumptuous. Mrs. Harrington blanched. That would be highly irregular. It would be an honor, Mr. Reynolds said enthusiastically, overriding her objection. Perhaps you could even provide feedback to all the candidates? I'd be delighted, Dr. Carter nodded. Now, who is this student, and what is he composing that sounds like part of a larger work? I only know he's applying for the pianist position, Mr. Reynolds replied. Mrs. Harrington handles the details. Both men looked at her expectantly, and she cleared her throat uncomfortably. He mentioned some sort of symphony, she said, as if the word caused her physical pain. A symphony? Dr. Carter's eyebrows rose. At his age? Fascinating. I think I'll take another stroll by the East Wing tomorrow, he said as he departed. Mrs. Harrington collapsed into her chair, trembling with anger. This had spiraled beyond her control. A symphony from a disadvantaged boy with the wrong background. Absurd. Yet he had caught Dr. Carter's attention, surely an embarrassment waiting to happen. She picked up her phone and dialed Blake's number. I need you to do something for me. The next day, Ethan walked into the East Wing practice room to find the door ajar. The sight before him froze his blood. The room had been ransacked, sheet music scattered, the piano bench overturned, and worst of all, his composition notebook was missing. No way, he muttered, dropping to his knees to search under the piano, behind the music stand. Everywhere. But it was gone. Years of work, the entire framework of his symphony, all his notations, edits, now vanished. He was still frantically searching when Lily arrived, shocked at the state of the room. What happened? Someone took my notebook. Ethan's voice was hollow. Everything was in there. The symphony, my audition piece, everything. Who would do this? Lily whispered, though they both silently knew the answer. The following day, Ethan stood outside Mrs. Harrington's office, took a deep breath, and knocked. At her call, he entered, noticing her feigned surprise. Mr. Miller, the audition isn't for several more days. Someone broke into the practice room and stole my music notebook, he said directly. I need to report it. Mrs. Harrington's expression turned professionally concerned. How unfortunate. However, students using practice rooms without permission assume their own risks. You don't understand, Ethan emphasized. That notebook contained everything. It contained, she cut him off, evidence that you were using school facilities improperly. She pushed a notice toward him. In fact, due to recent vandalism, I've been forced to prohibit all non-music program students from using the practice rooms. Ethan looked at the paper, an official order banning him from any music room until further notice. But my audition will proceed as scheduled, just without your original composition. I suppose you'll have to come up with something else. She smiled, the expression devoid of warmth. That evening, Ethan sat on the apartment building's fire escape. gazing absently at the city lights. His mother found him there, draped a warm blanket over his shoulders, and sat beside him. "Want to tell me about it?" she asked gently. He told her everything: the stolen notebook, the band, the seemingly impossible audition. "Maybe this is a sign, Mom. I was just kidding myself." Mrs. Miller was silent for a moment. "Your father faced much worse, you know. When he tried to break into the jazz scene in New York, they wouldn't let him play in clubs because he didn't fit their image." Her voice was soft but steady. "Know what he did? He took his music to the streets, played until crowds filled the sidewalks, and forced those club owners to take notice." She turned to Ethan, placing a hand on his cheek. "Your music isn't in that notebook, Ethan. It's in here." She touched his chest. "No one can steal that." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling his heart beating strongly. The melodies still surged within, unstoppable. "I don't have my notes, but I still have 3 days. I can rewrite it. Not all, but enough." Mrs. Miller smiled, pride gleaming in her eyes. "That's right, baby. And remember what your father used to say. Remember? Music finds a way," they said together. The next morning, Ethan arrived at school early, determined to find a place to practice despite the ban on music rooms. He wandered the hallways and unconsciously stopped outside the main auditorium, where a grand piano sat silently under dim lights. Seeing no one around, he slipped inside. The space was empty, the piano beckoning. He approached cautiously, lightly running his fingers over the polished wood before sitting down. Just as he was about to strike the first note, a deep voice resonated. "If I were you, I wouldn't do that." Ethan started, his heart racing. From the shadows of the wings emerged the imposing figure of Dr. Carter, immaculate in a gray suit despite the early hour. I'm sorry," Ethan stammered. "I know I'm not supposed to be here." "And yet, here you are." He approached, studying Ethan with penetrating eyes. "You must be the young composer I've heard about." Ethan stood frozen, suddenly realizing he was face to face with Dr. Carter, the renowned conductor. You're Dr. Carter. And you're Ethan Miller." He gestured to the piano bench. "Sit, play something for me." "But I'm not allowed. Mrs. Harrington won't let me." Dr. Carter raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. Has she also banned my right to invite guests?" He held out his phone, showing Ethan an email. "I've reserved this auditorium for my private rehearsal for the next 2 hours. You're my invited guest." Ethan hesitated, then sat back down. "What would you like to hear, sir?" "What was stolen?" Dr. Carter replied deliberately. Ethan looked up in shock. "You know about that, too. I make it my business to pay attention to exceptional talent, especially when someone is trying to snuff it out." He sat in the front row, folding his arms. "Your symphony. Play what you remember." Ethan closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began. Without his notebook, he relied on memory and instinct, letting the music flow. He played continuously for nearly 20 minutes, weaving melodies and variations, his fingers recreating what his heart knew by rote. When he finished, the auditorium was silent. Dr. Carter sat motionless, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," Ethan said into the silence. "Without my notes, there are parts I've forgotten." "When did you start formal composition training?" Dr. Carter asked abruptly. I actually haven't had formal training. My dad taught me piano until I was 8. When he died, I taught myself." Dr. Carter rose, approaching the stage, regarding Ethan with profound eyes. "What you just played demonstrates a mastery of complex harmonic integration that many conservatory students would envy. Yet you say no one instructed you?" Ethan lowered his head. "Just my mom and recently Lily." "From now on, that changes," Dr. Carter said decisively, opening his briefcase to remove a leather-bound notebook. "I want you to reconstruct your symphony here. We have 3 days until the audition, and I'm going to help you prepare to prove your abilities beyond anyone's denial." "Why are you helping me?" Ethan asked, bewildered. Dr. Carter's gaze softened. Because 30 years ago, I was you, a young black man with talent but no connections or pedigree. Music is the most democratic of arts. It doesn't care about your bank account or your zip code, only what you have to say. For the next 2 days, Ethan met Dr. Carter before and after school in the auditorium. They worked intensively, Dr. Carter constantly challenging Ethan's thinking, expanding his technical vocabulary, refining each idea. "Your instincts are superb," Dr. Carter said during their final session. "But instinct alone isn't enough. You need discipline and knowledge to shape raw talent." Was it like that for my father's generation too? Talented but without opportunity, so their voices just faded away? Ethan asked quietly. Dr. Carter nodded solemnly. Many musical geniuses never shone because doors remained firmly shut. That's why those who break through must hold the door open for others. At the end of their session, Dr. Carter handed Ethan a business card. "Whatever happens tomorrow, call me. We have work to do, you and I." Ethan held the card like a precious artifact. "I won't let you down, sir." "You should be concerned about letting Mrs. Harrington down." Dr. Carter smiled meaningfully. The next morning, Lily found Ethan in the library, hunched over Dr. Carter's leather notebook, frantically writing. "Where have you been hiding? I've looked everywhere for you." "I've been practicing with Dr. Carter," Ethan replied, eyes not leaving the page. "He's helping me reconstruct my symphony." Lily's eyes widened. "Dr. Carter? The famous conductor?" Ethan nodded, still writing. "He's amazing, but we're running out of time." "I have something." Lily rummaged through her bag, pulling out several crumpled pages. "Remember when we first started practicing together? I took notes on some of your compositions. Just fragments, but they might help." Ethan accepted them, astonished. On those carefully notated pages, Lily had copied theme motifs, chord progressions, even some counterpoint from the third movement. You did this?" Lily blushed. "I study music theory, was curious about what you were composing. It's not much." "It's a lot," Ethan exclaimed, immediately incorporating them into the missing sections. "Between this and what I've done with Dr. Carter, I might just make it." Just then, the library doors swung open, and Blake Wellington strutted in with his entourage. He spotted Ethan and Lily and sauntered over. "Oh, if it isn't Mozart and his groupie. Heard you lost your notebook? Such a shame." Ethan remained silent, focusing on writing. "It's pointless anyway," Blake said loudly. "Mrs. Harrington told me the pianist spot is practically mine, because we need to maintain standards." "Don't you have anything better to do?" Lily asked coldly. "Like practicing for your own audition?" Blake shifted uncomfortably. "Unlike some people, I don't need to scramble." He leaned down, looking at the pages Ethan was writing. "A symphony? Looks like chicken scratch to me. Step away from my student, Mr. Wellington." A commanding voice rang out. Dr. Carter stood in the doorway, his presence imposing. "Your student?" Blake repeated, confusion and fear evident. "Indeed. Mr. Miller here is working on a special project for me, and I don't appreciate interruptions." Dr. Carter approached, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You'd do better to focus on your own audition. I'll be on the judging panel after all." Blake paled, mumbled an apology, and hastily retreated with his friends. "That was awesome," Lily giggled. Dr. Carter smiled slightly. "Power should be used where appropriate. How are we progressing?" "Much better." Ethan held up Lily's notes. Lily had transcribed parts of my work from before. "Commendable," Dr. Carter nodded. "Perhaps you should join us this afternoon. I've reserved the auditorium from 3 to 5. "I'd be honored," Lily whispered. That afternoon the three worked seamlessly as a well-oiled machine, Dr. Carter directing, Ethan at the piano, Lily adding violin and helping with transcription. By 5 o'clock they had reconstructed a 10-minute excerpt of the symphony, enough for the audition. "Remember, Dr. Carter instructed Ethan as they packed up. "Tomorrow isn't just about getting into the music program. It's about claiming your rightful place in the musical world. Don't just play with your hands. Play with your heritage, your experience, and your truth. What if they still won't listen? Ethan worried. Oh, they'll have to listen, Dr. Carter said gravely. I'll make sure of that. The day of the audition dawned bright and clear. Westfield Academy's auditorium buzzed with preparation sounds. Students hurriedly practicing, parents adjusting ties and dresses, teachers arranging scoring sheets. Mrs. Harrington was still in charge, clipboard in hand, forced smile barely masking her tension. Dr. Carter's presence in the front row beside Mr. Reynolds had upset all her carefully laid plans. We'll proceed in alphabetical order, she announced, avoiding looking at Ethan, who sat quietly in the back row. We have 8 candidates. I expect all of you to maintain a professional demeanor. Ethan watched each student perform, all technically proficient, clearly well-trained. Blake was particularly skilled, playing a Chopin etude with textbook precision. Throughout his performance, Blake kept glancing at Dr. Carter, hoping for a positive reaction. But Dr. Carter's face remained largely impassive, neither criticizing nor praising. When Lily's turn came, her violin performance was filled with passion, technically strong but distinguished by its emotional depth. At the conclusion, Dr. Carter gave a slight nod, his first reaction of the entire session. "Ethan Miller," Mrs. Harrington finally called, her voice tight. The auditorium buzzed as he approached the grand piano. Many had heard rumors about the janitor's kid who claimed to be a composer, drawing a larger crowd than usual. Ethan sat at the piano, closed his eyes momentarily, and then began his classical piece, Beethoven's Pathétique. He played it in his own style, emphasizing emotional connection over strict adherence to tradition, but the technical proficiency was undeniable. When he finished, scattered applause broke out, quickly silenced by Mrs. Harrington's stern gaze. "And your original composition?" she asked, scribbling on her sheet without looking up at Ethan. Ethan took a deep breath. "I'll be performing an excerpt from my symphony, Unheard Voices. I've dedicated it to forgotten black composers and musicians throughout history who never received proper recognition." Mrs. Harrington paused her writing. "A symphony? Seriously, Mr. Miller? Isn't that rather ambitious for an audition at this level?" "On the contrary," Dr. Carter spoke up, "I believe this is precisely the venue for ambition to be voiced. Please continue, Mr. Miller." Ethan nodded gratefully and began to play. The melody started softly, tentatively, then gradually grew more complex and intense. His hands moved rapidly, blending classical motifs with jazz harmonies, traditional spiritual themes with modern techniques. A multicolored tapestry of sound that should have been discordant, yet came together in extraordinary harmony. The auditorium fell completely silent. Even Mrs. Harrington stopped taking notes, her score sheet sliding from her lap. As the piece built to its climax, Ethan caught sight of Lily quietly picking up her violin, joining in exactly as they had practiced. The piano and violin interacted, conversed, supported each other, sounding at once ancient and fresh. They concluded, the final note still resonating in absolute stillness. Then Dr. Carter stood and applauded. Mr. Reynolds followed, and soon the entire auditorium rose in ovation. Parents, students, teachers, everyone except Mrs. Harrington, who sat frozen, her face ashen. "Enough!" she suddenly shouted over the applause. "This is completely irregular. Ms. Zhang was not authorized to participate in Mr. Miller's audition, and it's clear that Mr. Miller had assistants composing this so-called symphony." "Indeed, he had help," Dr. Carter replied, approaching the stage. "That help was me." You secretly coached a candidate?" Mrs. Harrington stammered. "Nothing violates protocol more than a teacher deliberately obstructing a gifted student," Dr. Carter stated firmly, "or turning a blind eye when a student's work is stolen." Mr. Reynolds came forward, puzzled. "What's going on, Vivian?" Before Mrs. Harrington could answer, Blake unexpectedly stood. "It wasn't her fault," he blurted out. "She just told me to take the notebook to see if he really could write a symphony. She didn't tell me to destroy it. But I got angry when I saw it was So good. So I... His voice trailed off, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Murmurs rippled through the auditorium. Ethan sat stunned at the piano, the truth washing over him like a wave. "Is this true, Mrs. Harrington?" Mr. Reynolds asked. His voice hardened. "I was only protecting the program's reputation," she justified, her authoritative voice faltering. "This boy has no training, no classical foundation." "But he has, Dr. Carter interrupted. "The most powerful raw talent I've seen in 30 years. What he's written, despite his youth, deserves performance by a professional orchestra. He emphasized, scanning the room, has the potential to become one of the most important voices in contemporary classical music." Mrs. Harrington's face contorted with a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and fear. The world she had controlled for so long was crumbling. "I believe," Mr. Reynolds said decisively, "we have sufficient information to decide on the pianist position." He turned to Ethan with a warm smile. "Unless you'd prefer to be our first ever composer-in-residence?" 6 months later, Westfield Academy's annual spring concert had transformed completely, for the first time featuring an original symphony composed by a high school student. The auditorium was packed to capacity, even attracting local television crews. Backstage, Ethan nervously adjusted his bow tie, his hands trembling slightly as he peeked at the audience. "Breathe," Dr. Carter reminded him, elegant in his conductor's tales. "Remember, tonight isn't just about you, but about the music and all those who came before you." Ethan nodded, touching the photo of his father that he carried in his jacket pocket. The orchestra, comprising the school's best students and several professional musicians who were friends of Dr. Carter, was tuning up. Ethan looked at the complete score in his hands. What had once been scribbles in a notebook now a bound work titled Unheard Voices, a Symphony in 4 Movements by Ethan Miller. Mr. Reynolds appeared, smiling broadly. "It's a full house. The entire board of trustees is here. There's even someone from Juilliard in the 3rd row." Following the audition incident, things had changed rapidly. Mrs. Harrington was suspended pending an investigation into discrimination. Blake received disciplinary action, but was allowed to remain after a public apology and enrollment in an ethics course. As for Ethan, under Dr. Carter's mentorship and a newly established scholarship, he continued to flourish. "Places everyone," Dr. Carter announced as the house lights dimmed. Ethan moved to the grand piano. This wasn't just a piece he had composed. He would also perform the solo parts. Across the stage, Lily caught his eye from the first violin chair, offering an encouraging smile. The curtain rose, Dr. Carter raised his baton, and with one fluid motion unleashed the first notes of Ethan's symphony. Music erupted throughout the auditorium. Powerful, complex, utterly original. Each movement told a story. The first of struggle and perseverance, the second celebrating heritage, the third praising creative fusion, and the final movement looking toward a hopeful future where all voices would be heard. When the final note faded, the auditorium fell silent for a beat. Then, thunderous applause erupted, the audience rising to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Dr. Carter had to pull Ethan forward to acknowledge the crowd. In the front row, Mrs. Miller, fresh from her shift and still in her nursing scrubs, wept tears of joy. Later, during the reception, amidst congratulations from audience members and music critics, Ethan spotted a familiar figure standing alone by the refreshment table, Mrs. Harrington. "Mrs. Harrington," he approached cautiously. She looked different, somehow humbled. "Your symphony was quite impressive," she admitted. "I was wrong about you." Ethan nodded, accepting without adding more. "I want to know," she asked quietly, "how did you learn to compose like that without any formal schooling?" Ethan considered for a moment. Music isn't just about rules or tradition. It's about having something to say and finding a way to say it. Everyone deserves that chance. He returned to his mother and Dr. Carter, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. His symphony had given voice not only to his personal story, but also to those who had been forgotten, dismissed, or underestimated. And somewhere, he was certain, His father was listening too. 1 year later, Ethan stood in the grand foyer of the National Conservatory of Music, gazing up at the marble columns and ornate ceiling. His reflection in the polished floor seemed more substantial now, less likely to shatter. The letter of acceptance in his hand still felt unreal. A full scholarship, the youngest student ever admitted to their prestigious composition program. "Ready for your first day?" Lily asked, appearing beside him. She too held an acceptance letter, hers to the conservatory's ethnomusicology program, her parents finally supportive after witnessing her passion and talent during the symphony's performance. "I still can't believe we're both here," Ethan said, watching students with instrument cases hurry past. "I can." Dr. Carter's voice came from behind them. Since the symphony's debut, he had become more than a mentor. He was family. His advocacy had opened doors that had previously been sealed shut. Talent always finds a way, with the right support. As they walked through the grand hallways, Ethan noticed a display case featuring programs from notable alumni performances. "Someday your work will be in there," Dr. Carter predicted, guiding them toward the orientation hall. "But not just mine," Ethan said firmly. "My music is never going to be just about me." He had spent the summer teaching piano to children from his old neighborhood, watching their faces light up as they discovered the same joy he had found years ago at his father's side. Already, his symphony had been performed by 3 professional orchestras, each performance bringing letters from young musicians of color who saw in Ethan a reflection of their own possibilities. Each letter strengthened his resolve to continue creating pathways where there had been walls. "You know, Dr. Carter said thoughtfully as they paused before the conservatory's historic performance hall, "there's a rich tradition of composers who changed music precisely because they stood outside the establishment. They brought fresh perspectives that transformed everything." Ethan smiled, thinking of his notebook. Not the original that had been stolen, but the leather-bound one Dr. Carter had given him, now filled with new compositions. "My dad always said music finds a way." "Indeed it does," Dr. Carter agreed. "And so do those meant to create it." The conservatory bells chimed, calling students to their first classes. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of history and the lightness of possibility in equal measure. Behind him lay a path marked by obstacles overcome. Ahead stretched a future where his voice, and the voices of all those he represented, would resound in concert halls around the world. As he stepped forward, Ethan carried with him his father's spirit, his mother's determination, Lily's friendship, Dr. Carter's guidance, and the legacy of countless unheard voices that would, through his music, finally be heard. In that moment, he understood that his journey wasn't just about proving Mrs. Harrington wrong, or even about personal vindication. It was about transforming pain into beauty, exclusion into belonging, and silence into symphony. With each note he composed, another door would open, another voice would join the chorus, and the music that had always been within him would continue to find its way into the world.